Hey, what's going on, brothers and sisters? This is Pastor Hassan, and it's Friday morning, and it's time for our Friday morning devotional. And so this morning, we're going to look at a text of scripture that deals with something that we don't really get all that excited about considering generally. It's something that we tend to try to avoid, and for a good reason. We're going to think this morning about the reality of death. I think it was Woody Allen, the actor slash movie director, who said something along the lines of, I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be around when it happens. And he wasn't talking primarily about watching other people die and all that kind of stuff, but about his own experience of death. Like, I'm not afraid of it, I just don't want to be around when it happens. But the reality is, like, all of us are going to be around when death happens, when it comes for us. It's not something that we can avoid. So I just want to look at this text of scripture from Psalm 49 and just make a few brief comments about the reality of death that will hopefully be encouraging, as odd as that sounds. So here it goes. In Psalm 49, beginning at verse 13. This is the path of those who have foolish confidence. Yet after them people approve of their boasts. Like sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd. And the upright shall rule over them in the morning. Their form shall be consumed in Sheol with no place to dwell. But God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol. For he will receive me. Be not afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increases, for when he dies, he will carry nothing away. His glory will not go down after him. For though while he lives, he counts himself blessed, and though you get praise when you do well for yourself, his soul will go to the generation of his fathers, who will never again see light. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beasts that perish. This text sets up for us two different types of people with two different destinations. On the one hand, you have the unfaithful, and on the other hand, you have the faithful. And the unfaithful, we're told, are destined for the grave, destined for death. And so it says, this is the path of those who have foolish confidence, who are arrogant. They trust in themselves. They trust in any and everything other than the true and living God. Verse 14 says, like sheep they are appointed for Sheol. Death shall be their shepherd. So that's their destination. That's like sheep for the slaughter. They're headed for the grave. And the upright shall rule over them in the morning. Their forms shall be consumed in Sheol with no place to dwell. So there's this grim, final picture of death for those who are unfaithful. But then in contrast to that, the psalmist says in verse 15, but God will ransom my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. So in contrast to the unfaithful, whose destination is the grave, the faithful are destined not for the grave ultimately, but to be received by God. Like that's the picture here. And so in light of that, he now turns, the psalmist does, to the righteous, to those who are faithful, and gives this practical bit of encouragement. And in light of the fact that you are destined to be received by God, even in death, he says in verse 16, be not afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increases. In other words, don't envy unfaithful people, unrighteous people, when you look at them presently and their life seems to be going just fine. In fact, at times they seem to be doing way better than you do. Don't envy people like that. And here's why. Verse 17, for when he dies, he will carry nothing away. His glory will not go down after him. He can't take none of that stuff with him. And that person's glory will die with them. And so it's helping us to put things in their eternal perspective. And it says in verse 18, for though while he lives, he counts himself blessed. Like you look at him, you think, oh yeah, that guy's living it up. He looks and examines his own life and thinks, yeah, I'm blessed. I got it made. And though you get praise when you do well for yourself, like we tend to think, we evaluate things by how they look externally. It says in verse 19, his soul will go to the generation of his fathers who will never again see light. Again, it's reminding us that like death is going to put an end to all of that. And then at that point, it'll be worth absolutely nothing. And then the psalm ends this way in verse 20. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like the beast that perishes. So people who live arrogantly, just sort of thinking like, I'm gonna grab life by the horns. I can do whatever I set my mind to. I don't need God. Like, so just full of themselves and what they can accomplish. The text says they're just like beasts that perish. And that's not to belittle people and say, oh, to diminish their value as human beings. It's simply to state the fact that just like animals, like people are mortal. Like we have mortal lives that have an expiry date attached to them. And so the psalmist wants to put everything in perspective for us. Like death, this is the destination for the wicked. The grave, boom, is coming. But it also reminds us, brothers and sisters, that for us, like we're not destined ultimately for the grave, though we too have an expiry date. We will die. But our ultimate destination is to be received by God. You see, brothers and sisters, believers die differently. We face death differently. Like we die just like everybody else in one sense, but in another sense, we die in a way that is completely unlike other people. Like Woody Allen, who said he's not afraid of death, but then kind of jokingly says, like, I just don't want to be around when it happens. We don't have to fear death. Why? Because we belong to the one who has conquered death. The one who has conquered, to use the language of Hebrews 2 verse 14, conquered the one who through his death has conquered the one who has the power of death. And so Jesus, by his perfect life, by his death on the cross, and by his resurrection, has overcome Satan and the grave and the penalty of our sin. And so we don't have to fear the coming of death. And we don't have to look at the reality of death and feel like, man, that's the end for us. But in contrast, we can be confident that we will be received by God because the one who came and lived and bled and died on our behalf was also raised, and he assures us that all those who trust in him will be raised as well. Like he is the resurrection. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And all of us as his people who are united to him, we will experience that same resurrection life. Not just now, but actual physical resurrection bodies after death. Death will not have the last word for us. And so, brothers and sisters, it's good for us to think rightly about the reality of death and put things into perspective in the here and now, but it's also helpful for us to keep in mind this eternal perspective. Like death sort of puts everything in this life in perspective for us, but if that's all we had to consider was like, okay, death is coming, then yeah, we have good reason to just sort of, what's the point? and like be discouraged and depressed even. But because we know that there's something coming on the other side of death that is infinitely glorious beyond anything that we could ever possibly imagine, we have great confidence and hope. And so, brothers and sisters, encourage one another to live soberly in light of the coming, the reality of death. But at the same time, let's encourage one another with the fact that we belong to the one who has overcome the grave, our risen Lord, Jesus Christ. And so God bless you today. Have a great day on this Friday, and do whatever you do to the honor and glory of our great God. And we'll talk to y'all later. Okay, take care.